There comes a strange moment in human relationships when someone stops giving constant attention and suddenly they become impossible to ignore. Not because they changed their looks, not because they started performing harder, but because their absence created something their presence never could: emotional tension. Most men believe attraction grows through constant effort. More messages, more reassurance, more availability. But human psychology rarely works that way. Because people adapt to presence surprisingly fast, attention becomes normal, predictable, expected. And once something feels emotionally guaranteed, the mind stops chasing it. But absence interrupts certainty, and that interruption forces reflection. That's when someone starts replaying conversations in their head, wondering why the energy changed, checking their phone more often, feeling a silence they didn't notice before. But because distance reveals emotional value in ways constant presence never can. And most people never realize this until they lose access to someone who once felt permanent. Here's what most men never realize. Human beings adapt emotionally faster than they admit. At first, attention feels powerful. The fast replies, the constant availability, the effort, the emotional consistency. In the beginning, it creates excitement because it feels intentional, rare, personal. But slowly, something shifts. Not dramatically, quietly. Because the human mind has a dangerous habit. It normalizes what becomes predictable. And that changes relationships more than people think. A man can spend weeks giving someone his full attention, morning texts, long conversations, emotional reassurance, immediate replies, always present, always available. At first, she notices everything. Then over time, she notices less, not because she stopped caring overnight, but because emotional certainty changes perception. People naturally become less emotionally alert toward things that feel guaranteed. That's the part nobody talks about. The moment someone feels permanently accessible, the mind stops paying the same emotional attention to their presence. The effort that once felt valuable slowly blends into the background, like a song repeated too many times. Still there, still good, but no longer consciously felt. And most men respond to this the wrong way. When they feel emotional energy fading, they increase effort instead of understanding psychology. More texting, more explaining, more trying to maintain the same emotional intensity. But constant emotional availability often removes tension. And without tension, anticipation disappears. That's when strange things begin happening. A delayed reply suddenly feels unusual. A quieter tone gets noticed immediately. One evening of silence creates more emotional reaction than 30 days of constant attention. Why? Because the brain notices change more than consistency. Imagine someone who always sends a good morning message, every single day. Eventually, it becomes emotionally expected, almost automatic. But one morning, nothing arrives. And suddenly, the silence feels loud. She checks her phone twice, then again later. Not necessarily because she lost control emotionally, but because something interrupted the emotional pattern her mind became accustomed to. That interruption creates awareness, and awareness creates emotional attention. This is why absence affects people differently than presence. Presence comforts the mind, absence activates it. And that's where everything slowly begins to change. Most people think attraction fades because feelings disappear, but that's rarely the full story. Sometimes, feelings become invisible simply because they became constant. Human psychology reacts strongly to contrast, to shifts, to emotional change, not permanence. That's why silence can feel heavier than conversation. And this is where absence begins changing perception in a way most people never expect. Because when someone is always present, the emotional experience becomes smooth, predictable, stable. The mind relaxes into it. There's no urgency to analyze it anymore. But the moment that pattern changes, attention returns instantly. A man who always replies within minutes suddenly takes hours. A person who constantly initiates conversation becomes quieter. The energy softens. The emotional presence pulls back slightly. And suddenly, the other person notices everything. Not always consciously. Sometimes it happens beneath awareness. But emotionally, something shifts. Because absence creates contrast. And contrast forces the brain to reevaluate emotional value. That's why a short silence can sometimes create more emotional intensity than weeks of talking. Not because silence is magical, because interruption creates awareness. Imagine a woman who became used to hearing from someone every night before sleep. It became part of her emotional routine, comfortable, familiar, expected. Then one night, nothing. No message, no explanation, just silence. At first, she tells herself it's nothing. But later, curiosity appears. Why did the energy change? And that single question creates emotional movement. This is the part most men misunderstand. They think attraction grows through constant reminders of their presence. But psychology often works differently. People feel emotional impact more intensely when they experience the contrast between presence and absence. Because the mind starts filling silence with thought. It replays memories, conversations, tone changes, small moments, and slowly, someone who felt emotionally predictable starts feeling psychologically intriguing again. That's when the dynamic changes, not loudly, quietly, because silence creates space. And space forces people to feel what constant attention once prevented them from noticing. Here's where human psychology becomes complicated. People say they want certainty, consistency, reassurance, and emotionally they do. But attraction operates in a different part of the mind. Because certainty comforts people, while uncertainty captures them. That's the contradiction almost nobody notices. When someone becomes emotionally predictable, the brain stops searching for answers. Everything feels understood, stable, safe. But the moment predictability disappears, the mind becomes alert again. A man who once replied with emotional intensity becomes calmer, slower, less reactive, not cold, not angry, just emotionally centered in a way that feels unfamiliar. Suddenly, she starts wondering things she never questioned before. Why does he feel different? Is his attention shifting? Why am I thinking about him more now? And without realizing it, emotional focus increases. Because uncertainty creates psychological tension. The human brain dislikes unfinished emotional patterns. It wants clarity, resolution, emotional certainty. But when certainty disappears slightly, the mind keeps returning to the person who created that feeling, again and again. That's why people often think about someone more after emotional distance appears. Not necessarily because love suddenly grew stronger, but because uncertainty reopened attention. Imagine this scenario. There's a man who spent months constantly reassuring someone, always available, always emotionally obvious. She cared about him, but eventually his presence became emotionally familiar. Then slowly, his behavior changes. He stops over-explaining himself, stops chasing every conversation, stops needing immediate validation. Now there are pauses, silence, space, and suddenly, she notices his absence inside moments where she once ignored his presence. That's when attraction quietly shifts from emotional comfort to emotional curiosity. Because mystery activates imagination, and imagination is powerful. The mind starts filling gaps with emotion, questions, possibilities, interpretations. Most men never understand this part. They think attraction is maintained by constantly proving value. But deep psychological attraction often grows when someone no longer feels emotionally desperate to be understood. That calm emotional distance creates tension, not toxic tension, human tension, the kind that makes someone stare at their phone longer than usual, replay conversations late at night, notice small behavioral changes they once ignored, and slowly, the person who felt emotionally guaranteed starts feeling emotionally important again. This is where most people misunderstand the entire psychology of absence. They assume distance is about manipulation, playing games, acting cold, pretending not to care. But real emotional distance doesn't come from strategy. It comes from self-respect. And people feel that difference immediately, because there's a huge difference between someone withdrawing to control attention and someone becoming quieter because they no longer need constant validation to feel valuable. One feels forced, the other feels powerful. A man with self-respect stops over-explaining himself. He stops chasing emotional reassurance every time energy shifts slightly. He no longer panics when silence appears. And strangely, that calmness changes how people see him, because emotional stability is rare. Most people react emotionally the moment they feel uncertainty. They double text, seek reassurance, try harder, talk more. But someone grounded behaves differently. They pause, they observe, they keep their emotional center intact. And that emotional restraint creates psychological weight. Imagine this scenario. A woman begins pulling back slightly. Replies become shorter. Energy changes. In the past, he would have immediately tried fixing it. More attention, more effort, more emotional urgency. But this time, he stays calm, not passive, not angry, not manipulative, just composed. He continues living his life without collapsing emotionally around her behavior. And suddenly, something shifts inside her perception, because desperation lowers emotional value. But calm detachment creates intrigue. She begins noticing his silence differently, not because silence itself is attractive, but because his behavior communicates something unspoken. My emotional state does not depend entirely on your attention. That energy changes relationship dynamics more than words ever can. And deep down, people respect what respects itself. This is why emotionally grounded people often feel more magnetic without trying. Their attention feels intentional instead of needy. Their presence feels calm instead of emotionally grasping. And when they become absent, the silence carries emotional meaning. Because people don't just react to words, they react to emotional energy. And self-respect changes that energy completely. Human beings rarely appreciate emotional access while it feels unlimited. That's the uncomfortable truth. When someone is constantly available, constantly giving, constantly present, the mind slowly stops treating their attention as something meaningful, not intentionally, subconsciously, because familiarity lowers emotional urgency, and this is where scarcity begins changing perception, not material scarcity, emotional scarcity. The quiet realization that someone's energy is no longer endlessly available. That realization affects people deeply. A man who once replied instantly now responds when he actually has time. Someone who always initiated conversations becomes more selective. The emotional overgiving disappears, and suddenly, his attention feels different, more intentional, more valuable, more noticeable. Because human psychology attaches value to what feels limited. People chase what they fear losing. They reflect on what no longer feels guaranteed. That's why emotional absence often creates delayed appreciation. Not because people are evil, because certainty blinds attention. Imagine a relationship where one person constantly carries the emotional weight, always checking in, always making effort, always keeping the connection alive. At first it feels loving, but over time, the effort becomes expected. Then one day, the energy changes. The constant messages stop. The emotional availability softens. The reassurance disappears. And the silence suddenly exposes how much emotional space that person used to fill. That's when reflection begins, not immediately, slowly, because absence forces comparison between what is and what used to be. And that comparison creates emotional awareness people often never had before. This is why some people only realize emotional value after distance appears. Presence comforts people. Scarcity wakes them up. But this is important. Scarcity only becomes powerful when it's natural, genuine, rooted in self-respect instead of emotional manipulation. Because forced distance feels performative. Real emotional scarcity feels different, calm, unspoken, authentic. And that authenticity creates emotional tension far stronger than chasing ever could. Because people don't deeply value what feels permanently guaranteed. They value what feels meaningful, yet capable of leaving. And that realization changes the entire emotional dynamic. This is the deeper truth most people avoid talking about. Not every absence is felt. Some people disappear, and nothing changes emotionally. No curiosity, no reflection, no emotional tension, just silence. Because absence alone has no power. What people truly miss is emotional impact. The feeling someone created while they were present. That's why certain people stay in your mind for years after leaving, while others are forgotten within days. It was never about how often they texted. It was about how they made you feel. A person can give endless attention and still leave no emotional imprint. Constant messages, constant availability, constant effort. But emotionally, nothing meaningful was ever exchanged beneath the surface. No calmness, no understanding, no emotional depth, just noise. And noise disappears quickly. But someone who made another person feel emotionally seen, understood, emotionally safe, creates something entirely different. Their absence echoes, because emotional experiences attach themselves to memory much deeper than routine interaction. Imagine this scenario. Two men leave the exact same relationship. One desperately tried to hold everything together through nonstop attention. He feared silence, feared distance, feared losing emotional control. The other brought emotional steadiness into the relationship. Calm conversations, quiet confidence, presence without pressure. When both disappear, only one absence keeps replaying inside the other person's mind. Because people remember emotional atmosphere more than words. They remember how their nervous system felt around someone. Safe, calm, desired, understood. And once that emotional experience disappears, the mind keeps searching for it. That's when absence becomes powerful. Not because someone vanished, because something emotionally meaningful vanished with them. This is why emotionally mature people never try forcing absence as a tactic. They understand something most people don't. You cannot manufacture emotional depth through silence alone. Silence only amplifies what was already there. If the presence was shallow, absence feels empty. But if the presence carried emotional weight, understanding, restraint, quiet confidence, then distance creates reflection naturally. And suddenly the person becomes difficult to forget, not because they demanded attention, because their presence once changed the emotional atmosphere around them. In the end, the strongest people are rarely the loudest ones. They don't force attention. They don't beg to be understood. They don't chase emotional validation every moment silence appears. And strangely, that's exactly why their absence feels heavy. Because real emotional power is quiet. Most people spend their lives trying to hold on to attention. They fear distance because distance feels like losing control. So they over-explain themselves, over-give, over-pursue. But the more someone fights to stay emotionally visible, the less impact their presence often carries, because desperation creates emotional noise, and noise fades quickly. But calmness lingers. Imagine someone who walks away peacefully when energy changes. No dramatic speeches, no emotional manipulation, no attempts to force affection back into existence, just quiet acceptance. That kind of emotional restraint leaves a deep psychological impression, because it feels rare. Most people expect emotional reactions. They expect pleading, chasing, emotional chaos. But when someone remains grounded instead, The silence starts speaking for them, and that silence creates reflection. Why wasn't he trying to stop me? How did he detach so calmly? Why does his absence feel louder now? That's when people begin understanding the emotional value they overlooked during constant access, not because absence is a trick, because emotional certainty had hidden the impact of that person's presence all along. And deep down, human beings often recognize value most clearly after contrast appears, after distance, after silence, after emotional space forces reflection. But this final part matters most. The goal is never to become emotionally cold. The goal is emotional self-possession, to stop collapsing emotionally every time attention shifts, to stop believing your worth depends entirely on someone else's consistency, to understand that real connection cannot be forced through endless pursuit. Because the people who leave the deepest emotional imprint are usually the ones who respected themselves enough to remain emotionally centered, even when relationships changed. And years later, those are often the people remembered most, not for how loudly they demanded love, but for how deeply their absence was felt once they were gone. And maybe that's the strangest part about human connection. People often don't realize your emotional value while you're constantly there, while you're replying, while you're reassuring, while you're making the effort feel easy, because familiarity hides impact. The human mind adapts to consistency so quickly that it stops consciously feeling what once felt special, but absence interrupts that illusion. Suddenly the conversations replay differently. The silence feels unusual. Your energy becomes noticeable precisely because it's no longer constantly available. And that's when people begin confronting emotions they ignored while you were present. Not always love, sometimes regret, sometimes curiosity, sometimes emotional realization. But something shifts, because absence has a way of revealing emotional weight that constant access conceals. Still, the deeper lesson was never about disappearing to gain attention. It was about understanding your own value enough to stop forcing your presence where it's no longer fully appreciated. That changes everything, because emotionally mature people don't beg to be noticed. They don't collapse every time attention changes. They don't chase endlessly just to feel temporarily wanted. They understand something quietly powerful. Real connection cannot be forced through constant pursuit. And ironically, the moment someone stops trying to control how they're perceived, people often begin seeing them more clearly. That's why the strongest presence is usually the calmest one, the one that doesn't need to announce itself constantly, the one that remains emotionally grounded, the one that can walk away without hatred, without chaos, without losing itself. Because some people talk endlessly and leave no emotional imprint at all. Others become silent. And somehow their absence changes the entire emotional atmosphere. Not because they played games, because their presence once meant something real.